our speaker. Jim McGowan we just got here together on the train. He's a senior advisor to the United Nations, where he helped develop the Global Environmental Facility into the world's largest environmental grant maker. And at the local level, James served as the chairman of the Environmental Commission for the town of South Orange, where he founded an annual celebration and cleanup of the Rahway River called River Day. And that's actually where we met last year. And a hands-on science program for middle and high schoolers known as the River Curriculum, what year they're doing that?
7th grade.
7th grade. So my son will be doing that next year.
Yeah, great.
He holds a degree in marine science and economics, and his mentors include the geologian Thomas Berry, the Sue's author Mine Deloria, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that.
Oh, Haudenosaunee scholar.
John Mohawk. He lives in South Orange. Welcome, John.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming. And
thank you. Okay. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Rutgers is really kind of in my family. I think my son's going to be going there as a freshman in the fall, and my wife's. Is this mine, by the way? Is it?
Yes.
Okay. There's no germs around my house. I'm telling you, just getting over something bad right now, so I might need that. But my wife also is an associate professor over at the medical school. So yeah, it's a great institution. I mean, its breadth is just amazing. You've got so much expertise here to take advantage of so many different areas. Certainly environmental science and global affairs too. But I always like to start by a talk like this by remembering when I attend a talk by the Native Nation person, or the American Indians as they're called. They always kind of recognize the land where they are as having belonged to a specific people. And it's very important, I think, to do that, because it's such a respectful thing and such an important historical memory to have. So, of course, in our case, in the Passaic River watershed, where we are, there's the Lenape Nation, as you probably know. And the Lenape Nation stretched out through Pennsylvania, across the Hudson, and passed through New York, and had a very sophisticated system here of roads and waterways. They would have a road that came right through here to the Hudson, a water system that went across the Hudson, and then into New York, where the three main tribes had a fantastic network, and it was always a great trading area. And then a canoe route that went across East River, across Brooklyn to the ocean-going canoes, which were then loaded and unloaded in the Brooklyn area. So it really, we tend to think that, oh, we've just placed this on nothing. No, all the streets, all the avenues typically follow trails. This was a heavily populated area and a very rich area. I've heard that people who lived here only had to work like 3 days a week to feed a family of 4, because it was the oysters and the game and the deer. And it was just a very rich area. It's always been that way, and it still is. So. I just want to recognize the Lenape people for giving us this land where this university sits, where we can have such important discussions at really such a crucial time, in history. So I don't really want this to be like one of those glitzy, TED Talks where you forget, every supposedly wonderful thing that was said as soon as you turn it off. You know how that happens. So even the format where I'm up here and I supposedly know something and you're out there and you don't, or I'm going to relate to you, is really, in a sense, not even true. Because I think that what's most important, you know already, and you've known since you were like 5 or 6 years old. You know at the deepest level of your being, the basic life-supporting elements of air, water, and land that we all share are precious, and that no one should be allowed to poison them. The problem is that industrial civilization has put us into a kind of trance and convinced us to take the perspective, or if you prefer, the belief, that it's okay to sacrifice life-giving systems as the price of quote-unquote progress. So against all our better judgment and the understanding that we carry deep in our psyches and from our earliest days, we're supposed to think it's okay to treat the thin layer of atmosphere. You see really how thin it is. It's just that little tiny blue halo around the Earth as an open sewer that we can pump 29 billion tons of CO2 into every year. You take a 6-pound gallon of gas, when you burn it, it's 20 pounds of CO2 into the air. So, and you know what it's like when you drive behind a truck and it's belching out diesel fumes. You just know it's not good for you. So, where did that idea come from? We all reject that deep in our bones, but we're sort of in this trance and think that, wait, it's okay, it's all right, fine, let them do it. No, it's actually kind of not. And many people throughout the world still believe it's not. Also that it's okay to fill the oceans with plastic, fresh water with toxic chemicals, that it's okay to destroy the land by clear-cutting the trees, dumping what is now 100 million tons of fertilizer and pesticides on the land every year. And much of that is toxic, much of that runs off into streams, causes a huge array of problems. So, the culture has worked very hard to convince us from a very early age to accept those desecrations as normal. They've been normalized. And our economy has been designed accordingly. That is, designed to extract as many non-renewable resources as possible and convert them into pollution and garbage as fast as possible. And we measure that through throughput as GDP, right? It's supposed to be a measure of our economic well-being, our prosperity. But is it really? Does our well-being depend on closing down the life support systems of the planet? Just think for a minute, of what we've been convinced to believe is normal, and that there's no other way to do business. It's crazy, and one way or another, it's not going to last. So even the study of this thing we call the environment, right? It's like separate, it's out there, it's some area, when in fact, the economy, the social fabric, every profession, our moment-to-moment existence are wholly owned subsidiaries of the quote-unquote environment. And it's like thinking that, okay, we can have healthy people on a sick planet, but of course, that's not possible. Because the environment is your next breath. The environment is your next drink of water. The environment is your next meal. The environment is you. It is us. And not some separate sector of the economy that just costs money or whatever. That's just, it's crazy, fallacious idea that is being exploded at graduate schools and other places all over the country because we realize the environment is in fact everything. So with that understanding, you can see climate change is not the problem, but a symptom of the problem. Extinction is not the problem, but only a symptom of the problem. Water pollution, desertification, so on, are only symptoms of the real problem, which is the perspective that considers the life-supporting infrastructure of our home planet to be available for destruction for profit. So it's the point of view that it's okay to do that is causing all the other problems. So we have to change our perspective. So we have to understand that perspective informs design. The current perspective is put every living system into a steep decline. We have no choice but to invent a future based on a different perspective, the perspective that you knew when you were 6, and still know to be true. The planet's life support systems are non-negotiable. So, we need to design a new operating system. And you're the programmers. You're the programming designers who need to proceed with a trust in the reality of your own sensibilities, which have been confirmed by science, that we can no longer poison the air, the water, and the land, because to do so is to poison the human species, along with all the others. So, in this regard, I'd like you to think of, what Buckminster Fuller, anybody know Buckminster Fuller? Very interesting thinker. What he said about spaceship Earth, he considered Earth to be a spaceship. He said, it's so ingeniously designed that no one even has a clue that we're on a planet, flying through the solar system at 1,000,000 miles an hour. That is design. So, let's think for a minute about how an Earth-based perspective would inform design. For starters, all aspects of the human endeavor, from our educational system, churches, governments, businesses, professions, all professions will have to change. It doesn't mean that we have to give up all our toys and live in hovels or something like that. It's not like the Monty Python film where the guy's slapping mud on top of the mud. It's the filthy mud. No, it's quite the contrary. It means that things need to be designed in a much more interesting and creative way because they'll have to be in sync with the ever-renewing cycles of the planet. Some people are calling these liberation technologies because they're actually very free. For example, I think we'd still have cars, obviously, but they'd be electric and their bodies would be made entirely of photovoltaic materials. We now have photovoltaic materials that are thin, that you can actually, sometimes you can spray them on, just attach wires. They have incredible technologies that are not being implemented, and I'll get into why later, why they're not. What about the design of cities and housing? Some cities, like, actually from Paris to London to Beijing, they're trying to ban cars in the inner cores. Wouldn't that make them more livable, more pleasant places? Would be all those fumes. How about water? How do you handle water, and how would food be processed? Well, there'd be more emphasis on local producers, local watersheds, and a healthy relationship between people and place. So if we change our perspective to one that accurately reflects reality, everything else will change accordingly over time. So this is the great work, and sort of the title of my talk, the great work, healing and resilience in the age of extinction, which is a great, task before us. But I think it will lead to the preservation and restoration, of the world, at least as it's considered to be inhabitable by people. Of course, it's going to continue. It's just a matter of whether we're going to continue as an experimental species. So, well, now the other thing is that you've probably seen, and I know that even my teenagers have, the videos of people driving through fiery hellscapes in California. Right? You've seen those. You know that we're in the middle of a mass extinction, the likes of which we haven't seen since the extinction of the dinosaurs when they went out of fashion 65 million years ago. The background, we're exceeding the background rate of species lost by 114 times. You know about the melting that's going on in Greenland and Antarctica, and the revelations that they're finding almost daily about new holes, new calving. I mean, it's amazing. So, but what's crucial in the climate change discussion is the rate of acceleration of climate change. That's the crucial figure. So the rate of acceleration has been steadily increasing. And that's due, part to there's massive self-reinforcing feedback loops that are now, with permafrost is melting, when ice melts. I mean, all these things are just like accelerating. Of course, most of the heat has gone into the ocean. 90% of the heat has gone into the ocean, which is beginning to expel the heat back. So we're at this crazy tipping point right now. You know about the two recent reports, one from the UN, the other from the US government, showing that climate change was going to be much worse than originally predicted. It's pretty bad when they originally predicted it was going to destroy the planet, right? So it's even worse than that. So my point is I don't need to be, an inconvenient Al Gore up here and plod us through all the depressing charts and graphs. I don't want to go for the fear appeal, because it turns out that there's only a finite pool of worry, and most of it gets taken up with immediate personal concerns. In this case, like, how long is that guy going to talk? How am I gonna not check my Instagram for that long? It's great. Donald Trump has a plan for solving climate change. He says that if we need to, we can lower the temperature dramatically just by switching from Fahrenheit to Celsius. So 37 degrees is the new 100. Problem solved. But I mean, even if we talk about people, and it's always important to try to relate that number, we have about 25 million refugees worldwide right now. They're expecting that number will increase 10 times to 250 million by mid-century due to climate change-driven problems. And I mean, I know this for a very personal fact because I have friends who, from Pakistan, from India, from Sri Lanka, and other places, they say, look, we're looking at 200 to 300 million people who are going to have to find a new place to live. And that's just in the Indian subcontinent area. And a lot of people don't talk about that because it's almost too scary. But of course, there are all the island states which are already wondering, where are we going to put our people? The Maldives, the Bahamas, and they're wondering, who's going to take us? So, but even that doesn't do it, because fear appeal only makes a ripple and then it's gone. Climate change, on the other hand, is an unprecedented long-term challenge. Cognitively, emotionally, creatively, in terms of our need to redesign everything based on a perspective that accurately represents reality. We have to figure out ways of institutionalizing and extending our attention to this task. So, and also, climate change is an existential threat. It's like you're inviting people to their own funeral. It's, young people like you are already worried. How are we going to make a living? Well, the world is falling apart. It's not a great look. But that's only on the surface of things. So, what I found, though, and this is part of the good news, that saving a habitable version of the world is a great adventure. And if you approach it as a type of creative work that you can engage in an infinite number of ways. For one thing, we know enough about human nature to know that the world is not going to be saved unless it's fun to do so. So, one of the ways that I've made it fun is by gathering together a group of colleagues, and we go out and we have beers, and we're very irreverent, and we talk about the state of play, and we laugh, and we have a great time. It's really important for you all to maintain contact with each other, and as you go through professional life, to develop a really important social network, because that's what you're going to need to face the challenges ahead. And it's one of the great things that makes it fun. You know, people, I mean, we're facing this incredible situation, and it's always, you know, great to be on this, you know, mission from God, if you will, like the Blues Brothers said. And everybody's in it together, and just facing these incredibly terrible odds. And believe it or not, you know, there's a lot of camaraderie that comes along with that. And they help you keep motivated and on track as you're going along. You have that kind of thing. So, now, a bit about me. And then, so this is the boring part. Good time to check your phones or whatever. In my 20s, I had the good fortune to know 3 people whose influence I carry with me every day. So these 3 people, John Mohawk, Vine Deloria, and Thomas Berry. I've brought them with me today in the forms of their books, because they're all passed on. John Mohawk, the brilliant Haudenosaunee scholar, French of all Iroquois, 6 Nations, the SUNY Buffalo professor, who, though uncredited, wrote this book, A Basic Call to Consciousness, which you can get. It's a Haudenosaunee message to the Western world. It was delivered to the UN by a delegation of Native Nations people in 1977. In it, he states, "We believe that all living things are spiritual beings. We are not a people who demand or ask anything of the Creator. Rather, we give greetings and thanksgiving to all the forces of life that are still at work, for the earth is a very sacred place." So that's John. He was an amazing guy. Super funny, too. Vine Deloria, Sue Arthur, another hysterical guy when he spoke, he just had you in stitches. But brilliant. Sioux law scholar, became an ordained minister, was a professor at University of Colorado Boulder, authored several books. His first one's got a great title, Custer Died for Your Sins. This one's called God is Red. It's one of my favorites. In it, he wrote, "Industrial civilization might succeed in making the earth uninhabitable for humans because we have downgraded the real world in favor of a supernatural world." So he was speaking of the clash between, you know, native and non-native religious worldviews in the Americas. And then finally, there's Thomas Berry, another brilliant guy, Sanskrit scholar, spent I think 20 years in India, 20 years in China, also a Catholic priest, a historian of cultures, and a professor at Fordham University. He wrote The Dream of the Earth and The Great Work. I have brought The Great Work with me. I can't recommend those 2 books strongly enough. He maps, you know, the whole journey of the universe, evolution, how our thinking got us to this point, and begins to map a way out. He's a fantastic guy. So all these people exhibited a radical creativity that really altered my perspective and gave me the courage to hold on to it in the face of complete denial, you know, on the part of the larger culture. So I was very fortunate to bring the thinking of these 3 people with me when I went to the United Nations in 1993. So let me give you a little bit of background on the UN's attempt to address the global environment. It started in 1967 when a diplomat from Malta by the name of Arvin Pardo gave an electrifying speech to the General Assembly in which he introduced the concept of the common heritage of mankind, right? And this was for the Law of the Sea Conference, the United Nations Law of the Sea Conference. That was the first time anybody ever thought of, like, well, he was talking about the seas beyond the national jurisdictions, because people were wondering, well, what about, you know, beyond our 200-mile economic zone and the rest of the ocean? Well, he said, well, that should basically belong to everybody. It belongs to the planet, to all people. And they began that thinking, and the next milestone came in 1972. The government of Sweden decided to convene the Conference on Human Environment. And at the Stockholm Conference, participants, they attempted to forge a common outlook, basically, how to address the challenge of preserving the Earth's environment. That was the first time that they crafted something called the Stockholm Declaration, and that espoused broad environmental policy goals and objectives. And then following Stockholm, there was a really dramatic increase in global awareness of environmental issues and international environmental lawmaking. During the 80s especially, the scientific community worldwide began to track the problem of CO2 emissions and the greenhouse effect. And that really burst onto the public's consciousness. Thanks, I think, partially, you know, to Carl Sagan who gave an incredibly accurate description of the phenomenon and its effects in 1990. And it's available on YouTube. It's his talk. It's just incredible. I encourage you to listen to it because it's probably the most pathetic assessment I've ever heard. So that really woke people up and led to the next big step, which was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, right? So in Rio, leaders from around the world, including our president at the time, George Bush, father, agreed for the first time to move on a number of environmental treaties. So they started the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which then led to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is supposed to help try to stem the species extinction rate. The Convention to Combat Desertification, because deserts are growing at a phenomenal rate. At this rate, the Midwest will become a desert. Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which is PCBs, chlorinating, benzene, DDT. Also, the Vienna Convention for Protection of the Ozone Layer, which is known mostly as the Montreal Protocol, because we started to see the holes in the ozone layer that were the result of these, refrigerants and other problems. So that really is one of the major successes so far, because they've been able to, reduce those ozone-depleting chemicals around the world. And lastly, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Mercury is a highly toxic, substance that has really penetrated the marine food chain, and unfortunately, we're all ingesting it now we go have sushi cooked. So, the Real Earth Summit was really a huge step, and delegates who attended realized that many countries didn't have the resources to comply with these conventions. Conventions listed all these things that sounded great. Maybe the quote-unquote developed countries could meet them, but how could a developing country meet them? So what they did is they formed a new entity, and that new entity is called the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. And it was designed to help fund projects, to help countries come into compliance with the treaties. They gave the GEF its own governing arrangement, including an assembly of all 183 member countries. And that meets every 4 years to discuss overall policy and financing. They have a rotating council of 32 member countries. That meets twice a year to approve projects, talk about other smaller level stuff. And then there's a secretariat at DC for operations and a science and technology advisory panel. Now, so there originally were supposed to be 3 implementing agencies for the Global Environment Facility that would actually present, develop, and do the projects. That was supposed to be United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank. Mainly the World Bank, because the Secretariat's in the World Bank building in DC. Didn't quite turn out the way that they intended, because as it turned out, I see it on camera, the World Bank was a little bit out of touch, and UNDP was much closer. UNDP has, I don't know how many, 100-something field offices. So they're much more in touch with what's happening on the ground, and so it was a much bigger opportunity for UNDP to develop projects. Anyway, right now, it's changed, and there are 18 implementing agencies, including the regional development banks, Africa Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, International Union for Conservation of Nature. They can now implement 4 years, so about $1 billion a year. And GF has become, it's like we said, the world's largest grant maker with 4,000 projects. 165 countries now underway. It's a good start. They've protected areas, if you put them all together, about the size of the country of Brazil. That includes marine and terrestrial protected areas. So, but whether a lot of those protected areas exist only on paper, or they're actually managed to preserve the biodiversity is an open question. So, on a more personal level, I was useful to UNDP, to the GEF, because I brought a perspective from outside the UN bureaucracy. I wasn't a career UN person. I was brought in as a consultant. And the first thing I had to do was write innumerable papers and give so many presentations to UNDP senior management to try to convince them that integrating the environment and the development in general and pursuing the GEF opportunity in particular was the future. And it was really hard because these were guys, and I have to say, mostly old white guys who were very stuck in the old environment versus development framework. Thought that it was one or the other. You can't do both. And what you do is you call in the companies, the external companies, to come into the countries and extract all the resources And that was what they would call development, which of course doesn't work so great for the countries. Corruption, they prop up bad governments, basically, it doesn't filter down to the people. So it became clear to the UNDP over time that the UNDP budget was shrinking and the GF budget was expanding. And the new paradigm of sustainable development was taking over. And they had to find ways to integrate, to pursue development in a way that wasn't, destroying the basic resources of the country, or poisoning people, or destroying communities. We talk about environmental justice. So how is that done? Rubber really hit the road. Next thing UNDP needed from me was to figure out how to communicate with people in the field so that we could get good, high-quality project concepts coming in. So I wrote what's called the UNDP GF Guidebook, and we sent that to UNDP country offices all throughout the world. That went down to the people at the local level, and the floodgates opened. We started to get tremendous, interesting ideas for projects, really very needed projects, and very committed people started coming on board. So, I was also kind of farmed out at this point because I was something of still a forward thinker and an anomaly. So I would write speeches for Kofi Annan, I would write speeches for other UN officials when they had to address environmental issues. That's what happens. But they tried to keep me very bottled up because they didn't want me going all over. And I was happy to stay focused in that way. So it was a really exciting go-go period in which the value of projects in our portfolio went from $30 million to over $1 billion. And on a personal level, I wanted to remain as a consultant. And I have to this day because I like bringing fresh ideas to the table. And I don't want to be beholden to the UN bureaucracy as a regular employee with all its careerist pressures. And what just happens is that once you get caught up, then you find that your truth-telling ability, as we were saying earlier, starts to degrade. You can't just come out and say, here's the truth, deal with it, because you want that next step up the ladder, or you want to be able to get your budget over here or there. For me, I love being, a consultant, a senior advisor, that can just lay it on the line, and they value that. People, I say what they can't say, and that there's value in that. So after about 10 or 12 years of back-to-back contracts with the UN, my first child was born, I began paying more attention to the local environment. And my work with the UN would continue really to this day when the right assignment comes along. But I take fewer UN contracts to focus on my own local environment, my own town instead. And as Gabrielle said, I took the chairmanship of the South Orange Environmental Commission. And in addition to building a team there that I'm very proud of, I wrote Your Ecological Address. I brought a few copies of that here. It's just a simple booklet. Helps people get beyond their street address and think about where they truly reside. Their local ecosystem, their local watershed. Where are you in space? It gives them the basics like, how did they form? What's basic geology? What species do they share it with? How do their daily actions affect their natural systems? So I wanted to bring that amorphous concept of the environment into people's backyards where it really belongs, where they have agency to actually affect it. River Day was designed to do the same thing, but on a community-wide basis. So that's now in its 10th year, and it brings together residents to clean trash out of the river and celebrate the diversity of life in the watershed. So there's food, music, exhibits, walking tours, participatory arts project. It's a really fun celebration. Brings people out, brings people together. And then in turn, River Day spawned the river curriculum, which has been integrated to 7th grade classrooms and also to the AP environmental classes at the high school. We got grants and put sheds at each of the schools, there's 3 sheds, and filled them with boots and testing equipment and so forth. And now every student in the district gets a chance to get into the river, test the water samples, plot them on data points, put them on maps, and come up with independent study projects, which they then complete and present to the public at River Day. So there's a nice synergy that goes on between the river curriculum and River Day. And so our goal now is to get other districts to try to adopt the river curriculum. Now, so where does that leave us? Well, we have to recognize, first of all, we're guardians of a planet undergoing a severe assault. The cumulative effect of the greenhouse gases emitted so far are the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima bombs being exploded every day. That's the heat effect right now. NASA says we're looking at about a 14-foot sea level rise by the end of the century. In the United States, about 40% of the population lives in coastal areas. Scientists here at Rutgers have shown that 60% of New Jersey coastline is at serious risk, and 10% could disappear completely within the next few decades. Globally, 8 out of the 10 largest cities are sitting right at the coast, right at sea level. So, although we're at this self-amplifying tipping point of global warming, there remain self-cooling feedbacks on the Earth that we have to encourage immediately, which means it's very good news for young people like you because the Earth is hiring. I believe that. And you couldn't ask for a better boss. The conversion from an economy that poisons our life support systems to a mutually enhancing human Earth economy is the biggest job opportunity of this century. It's time to look, at what needs to be done to create a regenerative economy, and check to see if it was possible or impossible only after you've done it. I'm very encouraged by the Green New Deal, so forth. I think it holds great promise. It's really the current incarnation of the Green New Deal. We've been working on this for decades, but it's great. It's getting traction to accelerate the transition of the energy economy to one that's renewable. Battery technology is coming up really fast. So many things are happening right now that might help us achieve what the Paris Agreement says we have to, which is that in order to limit the temperature to an increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which scientists have decided is about the threshold for human survival, as we know it, 1.5 degrees centigrade, emissions have to peak at 2020, the year 2020, and then they have to halve by 2030, half again by 2040, and half again by 2050. So it's a 7% annual reduction in emissions. So what we've got to do is make the U.S. carbon neutral by around 2050, and then turn the country into a giant carbon sink. Trees, sea grasses, all sorts of natural technologies to start absorbing the carbon back out of the air and stabilizing the climate. So to do that, we need exponential growth in renewable energy, and it's perfectly doable. The latest contracts for solar are coming in at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, which are half the price of coal. But the obstacle, we'll get back to that now. The main obstacle is that after 150 years of highly profitable operations, the fossil fuel industry has gained enormous political power. They're now wielding to hold back the renewable revolution. Since 2000, that industry has spent about $2 billion lobbying government to freeze, stop, don't take any action on climate change. We need to preserve our hegemony as a power-producing industry. But, they've outspent climate activists 10 to 1. But 515 companies have signed up for climate action, and the fastest growing job in the U.S. is solar installer. The second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. Solar employment grew 9 times faster than the overall economy between 2010 and 2016. It now employs twice as many workers as the coal industry and 5 times as many as the nuclear industry. So that's the technology side, but there's also an enormous need for professionals who can help with climate resilience and coastal retreat. The insurance industry is already preparing for an uninsurable world. Climate change weather-driven events cost them a total of $306 billion in 2017 alone, just that 1 year. So rising seas threaten infrastructure necessary for local jobs, roads, bridges, subways, water supplies, power plants, sewage treatment plants, landfills. The list is practically endless. So the priority for me is to decommission all nuclear power plants that are sitting at sea level, because they have these large warehouses of spent fuel rods, which are highly radioactive. Those things need to be immediately decommissioned and cleaned out. We also need a plan to resettle about half the U.S. population. It's going to take a lot of people. It's a gigantic task. So it's going to require professionals across the board. It doesn't matter what profession you're going to be in, you're going to be in the environmental profession. That's basically it. I don't want to go on too long. In closing, I just want to say that we are very fortunate to be living in a place where we can look to indigenous wisdom that sees our role as caretakers of the regenerative cycles by which nature produces abundance and can be shared by all life. To go back to close with my 3 friends, John Mohawk at the UN delegation in 1977 to Geneva said, "We believe that native people of the Western Hemisphere can continue to contribute to the survival of the human species. People need to break with the narrow concept of human liberation and begin to see liberation as something that needs to be extended to the whole of the natural world, the things that support life, the air, the waters, the trees, all the things that support the sacred web of life. Thomas Berry wrote, "The greatest human discoveries in the future will be the discovery of human intimacy with all those other modes of being that live with us on the planet and with which we exchange the very substance of life. An indispensable resource in fulfillment of this task is the guidance of the indigenous people of this continent, for they have understood the integral relation of humans with this continent and the entire natural world." Michael Laureate put it this way: "The future of mankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up responsibility to all living things, who will listen to the trees, the animals, and the birds, and the voices of the places of the land." So I may not always succeed, but I try to take their guidance. I invite each of you, to consider reading their works. They're really rich. They'll bring you home to your original and true sensibilities that the water, the air, and the land, with its diversity of life, are the well springs of our existence, and no one has the right to desecrate them. I have faith that you could design the world of the future accordingly. So, do the great work. Thank you.